I didn't have much of a choice. Bills were piling up, my last paycheck was already gone, and the eviction notice felt like it was burning a hole in my mailbox. So, when I saw the job listing, live-in caretaker needed for a historic mansion, good pay, housing provided, it felt like a lifeline. I didn't think twice before calling the number. The man on the other end introduced himself as Mr. Whitaker. His voice was calm, deliberate, and he wasted no time explaining the job. "You will maintain the house, handle basic upkeep, and ensure the rules are followed," he said. "Most of the time, you'll be alone. Think of it as peace and quiet with a steady income." It sounded too good to be true, but desperation makes you ignore the red flags. A caretaker job for an old mansion. I figured the worst I'd have to deal with was the occasional rodent or leaky roof. We agreed to meet at the property the next day. The mansion was about an hour outside of town, perched on the edge of a forest, like something out of a Gothic novel. As I drove up the gravel path, my first thought was how massive it was. 3 stories tall, with arched windows, and ivy crawling up the stone facade. It looked both majestic and menacing. The kind of place that had seen better days, but still carried an air of faded grandeur. Mr. Whitaker was waiting for me at the front door. He was an older man, sharply dressed, with a face that didn't betray much emotion. After a brief handshake, he led me inside. The interior was just as impressive and unsettling. High ceilings, ornate chandeliers, and dark wooden furniture covered in dust sheets. Every step echoed, the sound swallowed by the vast emptiness. "This house is special," Whitaker said, his voice carrying a weight I couldn't place, "and it requires our specific attention." He handed me a folded piece of paper. "These are the rules. Follow them exactly, and you'll do just fine." I unfolded the paper and skimmed the list. "Do not look into any mirrors after midnight. Ensure every door is locked by 11:59 p.m., even if you didn't open it. Never go into the attic. If you hear footsteps in the hallway, ignore them. Do not speak to anyone outside, no matter what they say." I chuckled nervously. "This some kind of joke?" Whitaker didn't smile. "No joke. These rules are non-negotiable. If you can't follow them, you won't last here." I wanted to press him for answers, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It wasn't fear exactly, but there was something haunted about it, as if he'd seen things he couldn't unsee. After a brief tour of the house and a quick run-through of my duties, Whitaker left. The silence that followed was deafening. I wandered through the halls, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. The rules nagged at me, absurd and ominous in equal measure. I told myself they were just quirks of an old man's imagination. But as the sun set and the shadows stretched across the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this job was very wrong. The mansion came alive at night, not in the way a bustling home does, but in the way an old wound aches before a storm. Every groan of the wood, every whisper of wind against the windows felt like it carried something heavier, something watching. I chalked it up to my nerves. After all, it was my first night on the job. I wandered through the halls, flashlight in hand, trying to familiarize myself with the layout. The house was massive, its winding corridors and towering ceilings amplifying every creak and shuffle. The floors were mostly hardwood, worn smooth by time, and the walls were lined with old paintings. Portraits of somber-faced men and women stared out from gilded frames, their eyes following me as I moved. The first floor was relatively straightforward. A grand staircase in the center of the foyer, a sprawling dining room to the left, and a library that stretched far deeper than I expected to the right. The kitchen, tucked away behind the dining room, was surprisingly modern, a stark contrast to the rest of the house. The second floor, however, felt different. The air was heavier, the shadows deeper. Bedrooms lined the corridor, each door shut tight except for mine, which was at the far end. A single mirror hung in the hallway, its surface warped and cloudy. I remembered the first rule: do not look into any mirrors after midnight. It was absurd, of course, but I still found myself avoiding its reflection as I passed. At 11:30 p.m., I decided to start locking the doors. I wasn't taking any chances, not after Mr. Whitaker's warning. Room by room, I checked and double-checked, making sure every latch and bolt was secure. The mansion's age showed in its locks. Some were stiff with rust, others barely clung to their frames. By the time I finished, it was 11:58 p.m. The house was quiet as I stood in the foyer, the heavy silence pressing against my ears. I glanced at the list of rules in my hand, the words glaring up at me like a challenge. Midnight came and went without incident. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and headed to bed, telling myself I'd overreacted. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt as though the walls were leaning closer, the darkness pushing in. I woke up 3 times that night, each time convinced I'd heard footsteps outside my door. Rule 4. If you hear footsteps in the hallway, ignore them. The thought made my skin crawl. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows, chasing away the unease of the night. I forced myself to laugh at how ridiculous I'd been. The house was old, sure, but there was no such thing as haunted mansions or cursed rules. I went about my day cleaning, repairing what I could, and exploring further. In the library, I found a curious thing, a section of the shelves that seemed to have been cleared out. Dust lined the empty spaces, except for a single book, lying flat on its side. Its cover was faded, the title unreadable. I opened it to find a handwritten note on the first page. You've made it through the first night. Keep following the rules. They're not for you, they're for them. A chill ran down my spine, but before I could think too much about it, I heard a noise, a faint creak from upstairs. I froze, my eyes snapping toward the ceiling. It was broad daylight, and I was the only one in the house, or so I thought. I climbed the stairs cautiously, each step feeling like it took hours. When I reached the second floor, the hallway was empty. My room at the far end stood open, just as I'd left it. But when I turned to glance at the mirror, I swore I saw movement. Not mine, something else. I turned away quickly, my heart's pounding. The rules suddenly didn't feel so ridiculous. The second night started with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. The rules no longer felt like eccentricities. They felt like boundaries, fragile and easy to cross. As I prepared for the night, I found myself glancing over the list again and again, memorizing the steps like my life depended on it. Do not look into any mirrors after midnight. Ensure every door is locked by 11:59 p.m., even if you didn't open it. Never go into the attic. If you hear footsteps in the hallway, ignore them. Do not speak to anyone outside, no matter what they say. The mansion was quiet as I moved through it, locking doors one by one. The air grew heavier as the minutes ticked closer to midnight, and the sound of my footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the house was amplifying them. I finished locking the final door in the library at 11:58 p.m., my heart racing as I glanced at the clock on the wall. I returned to my room and sat on the bed, gripping the flashlight tightly. Midnight came and went without incident, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to relax. Maybe the rules were just elaborate scare tactics, something to keep me on edge. Maybe I was imagining the weight of the air, the way the shadows seemed to move at the edges of my vision. Then I heard it. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible. A soft creak, like someone stepping on an old wooden floor. It came from the hallway, just beyond my door. My pulse quickened as I remembered Rule 4. If you hear footsteps in the hallway, ignore them. The sound grew louder, each step deliberate and measured. I froze, gripping the edge of the bed, my ears straining to follow the noise. It stopped just outside my door. The handle turned. My breath hitched as I stared at the knob, willing it not to move any further. It rattled slightly, then fell still. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, my mind racing through the possibilities. A prank, a loose hinge, something inside me knew better. I stayed rooted in place, refusing to make a sound. After a long, agonizing pause, the footsteps resumed, this time moving away from my door and fading into the distance. I let out a shaky breath, my body trembling. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. I didn't sleep. Every creak, every groan of the house felt amplified, like the building itself was alive. By dawn, I was exhausted, but relieved to have made it through the night. I told myself I'd done everything right. The rules had worked. But as I stepped out of my room, something felt wrong. One of the doors in the hallway was ajar. It was a guest bedroom I hadn't touched the night before, and the lock was undone. My stomach churned as I approached, my flashlight cutting through the dimness. Inside, the room was empty, except for a single item on the bed, a key. It was old, ornate, with a tag that read attic. I stared at the key for what felt like an eternity. The word attic etched into the tag sent a chill down my spine. Rule 3 was clear, never go into the attic. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, to walk away, and pretend I'd never seen it. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, and the longer I stood there, the harder it became to resist. By the time the sun began to set, I had convinced myself I needed to know what was up there. If the rules were meant to keep me safe, then what exactly was hiding in the attic? And why had someone or something left the key for me to find? Night fell quickly, and as the shadows deepened, the house seemed to close in around me. I waited until 11 p.m. before finally making my move. The key was cold in my hand as I climbed the grand staircase to the third floor, where the attic door waited. It was smaller than I expected, tucked into the corner of a dusty hallway. The wood was warped and cracked, the handle covered in rust. I hesitated, the rules flashing through my mind like a warning, but my hand moved on its own, fitting the key into the lock. and turning it with a soft click. The door creaked open, revealing a steep, narrow staircase that disappeared into darkness. The air inside was different, colder, heavier, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my skin prickle. I climbed the stairs slowly, my flashlight sweeping over the walls. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, trunks, and cobweb-covered artifacts that seemed untouched for decades. The smell of dust and decay was overwhelming. As I ventured deeper, my flashlight flickered, the beam weak and unreliable. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting and writhing as if alive. Then I saw it, a large wooden chest in the center of the room, its lid slightly ajar. Something about it felt wrong, as though it didn't belong in this world. Against my better judgment, I approached the chest and lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of strange objects, cracked porcelain dolls, old photographs with faces scratched out, and a book bound in worn, leather-like material. My hands trembled as I opened it, the pages filled with cramped handwriting that seemed to pulse under the light. The book wasn't just a journal, it was a record. Each page detailed the mansion's history, its previous caretakers, and the rules they had to follow. The handwriting grew more frantic as it went on, describing entities that lived in the house, bound by the rules, but constantly attesting their limits. They are watching. They will always watch. The rules are not just to protect you, they are to keep them contained. The final entry sent a shiver down my spine. Do not go into the attic. If you are reading this, it is already too late. A loud creak broke the silence, and I spun around, my flashlight jerking wildly. One of the mirrors propped against the wall had fallen forward, its surface reflecting something that wasn't there. A tall, shadowy figure loomed behind me, its form shifting and unnatural. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of the chest. The mirror cracked, and the figure disappeared. But the air in the attic grew colder, the pressure so intense I could barely breathe. A faint whisper echoed through the room, low and guttural, saying my name. Panicked, I slammed the chest shut and bolted for the stairs, nearly tripping as I descended. The door to the attic slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the hallway. My chest heaved as I leaned against the wall, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The rules weren't just arbitrary guidelines. They were the only thing holding this house and whatever was inside it together. And I had just broken one of the most important ones. Breaking the attic rule had changed something. The house felt different now, more alive, if alive meant filled with a malevolent, watching presence. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the shadows in the corners of my vision felt intentional, like the house itself was aware of what I'd done. That night, the rules seemed impossible to follow. I moved through the mansion mechanically, locking every door as the clock ticked closer to midnight. My hands shook as I turned each key, the sensation of unseen eyes on me growing heavier with each passing second. By the time I reached the final door in the kitchen, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. As I turned to leave, I heard it, a knock at the back door. Soft at first, almost tentative, but growing louder with each repetition. Rule 5, do not speak to anyone outside, no matter what they say. Tom, a voice called, muffled through the thick wood. It's me, Mr. Whitaker. Open the door. I froze, my blood running cold. I hadn't spoken to Mr. Whitaker since my first day, and he had made it clear he wouldn't return unless absolutely necessary. The knock came again, harder this time. Tom, you're in danger. Let me in. The urge to respond was almost overwhelming. My hand hovered over the doorknob before I caught myself. The rules weren't just for show. If I broke another one, I had no doubt it would be the last mistake I'd make. I stepped back from the door, ignoring the voice as it grew more insistent. You broke the rules, Tom, it said, the tone shifting, becoming deeper, more guttural. You let them out. Now they're coming for you. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so thick it pressed against my ears. I stumbled out of the kitchen, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and headed for my room. The hallway felt longer than usual, the shadows stretching and twisting in ways they shouldn't. Then I heard the footsteps. They started faint, like soft taps on the hardwood, but quickly grew louder, heavier. Rule 4, if you hear footsteps in the hallway, ignore them. My breath caught as the sound came closer, stopping just outside my door. I sat frozen on the bed, the list of rules clenched in my fist like a talisman. The door handle turned, slowly, deliberately. My heart raced as I stared at it, willing it not to move further. But the door didn't open. Instead, a shadow seeped through the gap beneath it, spilling into the room like ink spreading across paper. I couldn't breathe. The shadow coalesced, rising into a form, tall, humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilting unnaturally as it stepped closer. The air grew colder, each breath coming out in visible puffs. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. "You broke the rules," it said, its voice a hollow echo that reverberated through my skull. "Now, you must take responsibility." I scrambled back against the wall, my hand brushing against the notebook I'd left on the bedside table. Frantically, I flipped through the pages, looking for anything I might have missed. The final entry from the attic book flashed in my mind. The rules are not just to protect you, they are to keep them contained. The figure moved closer, its presence suffocating. My fingers found the flashlight, and I clicked it on. The beam pierced the darkness, hitting the figure squarely. It recoiled, its shape flickering and distorting like a bad signal. Taking advantage of the moment, I bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me. The hallway was no longer empty. Shadows moved on the walls, crawling toward me like living things. The footsteps resumed, echoing from all directions. I ran blindly, the list of rules flashing in my mind, trying to remember which ones I hadn't yet broken. The library, the thought hit me like a thunderclap. The locked door from the first night, the one that had been left open afterward. I had to make it there. If the rules were holding the entities back, maybe that room held something that could stop them. I burst into the library, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. The room was dark, the rows of shelves towering like silent sentinels. At the far end, the empty space on the shelf where the book had been lay illuminated by the moonlight. My flashlight swept over it, revealing faint scratches in the wood beneath the dust. The rules bind them, but if they are broken... Run. The shadows pooled outside the door, pressing against it. The handle rattled, and the wood began to splinter. I backed away, clutching the flashlight and the notebook like lifelines. Then, the door burst open. The door exploded inward, the force of it sending shards of wood flying across the library. Shadows poured in like a living tide, writhing and twisting as they spilled into the room. My flashlight flickered, its beam barely cutting through the mass of darkness. In the midst of it all, the tall figure emerged, its distorted form shifting as it stepped toward me. "You broke the rules," it said again, the voice hollow and layered, as if multiple people were speaking at once. "Now, you must pay." I stumbled back, my flashlight trembling in my hands. My mind raced, desperate for a way out. The rules, they were the only thing that had kept me alive this long. Even now, as the house closed in around me, I clung to them like a lifeline. The library, why had they left the book in here? Why had the rules brought me back to this room? My gaze darted to the empty shelf where the journal had been, the faint scratches on the wood catching the light. The words I'd read earlier came rushing back. The rules bind them, but if they are broken... Run. The rules bind them. I turned my flashlight toward the shelves, frantically scanning the titles. Books on history, architecture, obscure folklore. They blurred together as I searched for something, anything that could help. The shadowy figure advanced, the temperature in the room plummeting as it drew closer. Then I saw it, a mirror, small and framed in ornate silver, leaning against the base of one of the shelves. Rule 1. Do not look into any mirrors after midnight. My stomach churned as I realized what I had to do. I grabbed the mirror, its surface cold and slick in my hands, and turned it toward the figure. The shadows recoiled violently, a guttural scream ripping through the room as the beam of my flashlight hit the mirror and reflected onto them. The figure's distorted form twisted and convulsed, its outline breaking apart like smoke in the wind. The room shook as the shadows retreated, the walls groaning under the strain, but the figure wasn't gone. Its head tilted sharply, and for the first time, it lunged. I dove out of the way, the mirror slipping from my grasp and shattering against the floor. Shards of silver scattered everywhere, the largest pieces catching the faint light and reflecting fractured images of the entity. It recoiled again, its form flickering in and out of existence. Seizing the opportunity, I bolted from the library, slamming the door shut behind me. The house was alive now, its walls groaning and shifting as I ran through the halls. The shadows followed, relentless and hungry, their guttural whispers echoing around me. I reached the front door, my heart pounding as I fumbled with the lock. The handle wouldn't budge. The rules flashed in my mind again. Ensure every door is locked by 11:59 p.m. But the opposite was true now. I had to unlock it, break this final barrier to escape. The shadows closed in, their presence pressing against my back as I fought with the rusted lock. Finally, it gave way, and the door burst open. I stumbled outside, the cool night air hitting me like a wave. Behind me, the mansion loomed, its windows glowing faintly with an unnatural light. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands trembled as I turned the key, the engine sputtering to life. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The mansion stood in the distance, its silhouette dark against the night sky, but in one of the windows, I saw a figure, a a shadow watching me leave. I thought it was over. I thought I had escaped, but as I sit here now, writing this, I can still feel it. The shadows move differently in my apartment. My reflection lingers too long in the mirror. And last night, as I lay in bed, I heard it. Soft footsteps in the hallway outside my door. The rules weren't just for the mansion. They were for me, and I think I've brought something back.